Hello friends, welcome to JavaEE EJP JPA tutorial. In this video and in the next coming 5 or 6 videos, we are going to learn the basics of JPA entity with an example. So here in this video, you will learn introduction to Java Persistence API. So here are the prerequisites. So even though we use JPA and EJB here in this sub-series, the JPA tutorial, we will create one more project called JPA. For JPA entity, we will create one project, and the project will talk to the existing projects which were created as part of this tutorial. So watch this one to create all 4 projects. So there are EAR project, then session bean and the client, then a web project, dynamic web project. Then here to learn JPA entities, we will create one more project called JPA projects or JPA project. So in this video, we won't create all these 4 projects. That's why we are asking to watch this video. Then in this subpart, we will create a new project for JPA. So this one is mandatory. Make sure you created those 4 projects, the base projects. Okay, here prepare the development environment for Wildfly within Eclipse. That means you will create a Wildfly runtime, then you will install required plugin for Eclipse. So those are all explained here in this video. How to watch this also. So first to prepare Wildfly environment, then prepare Eclipse to have plugin. That plugin will contact the Wildfly environment to start and stop the server, as well as deploy the deployable unit into the Wildfly. So that's explained here. Here we will create all the base projects required. So to continue with the JPA entities here, from this video onwards, we are moving into Java Bean as well as JPA. So since we use JPA entities, you need to set up the environment for SQL Server. So this video is for 08. This video is to add SQL Server connection within Eclipse. So this one is optional. Here we already specified, but it's a recommended one. So it will give a lot of a facility, and even you can make use of JPA tools within Eclipse. So Eclipse should know how to connect to SQL Server. So make it ready. Or if you bypass it, then you can do all the database related queries in the SQL Management Studio, and some of the JPA tools won't work, and yeah, even without the tool working, we can code it, but the JPA tools are useful when you are developing the JPA entities. All right, so you can give a try here. Then this one is required. So here you have to set up the Wildfly environment to contact the SQL Server database. So this video explains. How you will create a data source driver so that Wildfly knows how to contact the DB and fetch information for the application. Next, the JPA and Enterprise Java Bean requires exposure towards the Java servlet. So there are 28 videos in our playlist, or if you have exposure towards the Java servlet, you can skip these 28 videos, and you should have some knowledge in JSP also. So here in this EJP JPA tutorial, we are using Enterprise Java Bean EJB 3x. In EJB 2x, entity beans are famous. These entity beans store information to DB. So in the last video, we talked about a stateful session bean. There we maintain the bean state between browser session, right? Here using entity bean, one can store those state information into the DB so that the state information can live across the browser session. That means the user can disconnect the browser and they can go to a different location and bring back the state. The data is in DB and hence it exists beyond the user session, just like as we told now. Okay, so entity beans are for EJB 2x, and EJB 3x makes use of session bean, especially the stateless session bean, with JPA to persist the data into the database. But if your vendor supports EJB 3x, they support EJB 2x also because of backward compatibility, and entity beans are available on your environment. So in modern days, people are mostly using EJB 3x with JPA to persist the information into the database. Here we are talking about JPA, right? JPA stands for Java Persistence APA. Persistence means storing something, and here we store the data into the database. So there is a API, Java Persistence API, which will provide rich functionality to store and retrieve data from the database. So the code involved to write bin data to DB is high. So to avoid this, JPA is coming into picture. And in EJP 3x, the combination JPA with the EJB is famous. JPA can be used in standalone Java application also. So that means this Java Persistence API, it's not stick to Enterprise Java Bean. So the API is written to communicate with the database. So that means this JPA can be used with a standalone Java application, desktop application, or in web environment. So the EJB and JPA gels together well. So that's why in EJP 3x, people are seeing that as an alternate to the entity bean. So this course, we will use it with the use it in the sense we will use the Java Persistence API with the stateless session bean. So you can use this with MDB also, but JPA recommends use stateless session bean or MDB. If you start using stateful, then there will be a lot of trouble in using it. So it is recommended to use JPA along with the stateless session bean as well as MDB. Okay, with this API, we can represent DB table, a table in the database, right? DB table as a Java class. So JPA is a persistence API. The persistence API, when you learn, you will see how a DB table is mapped to a Java class. So JPA deals with entities. So when you are going through this course, towards the end, you will very well know what is entities. But for now, you can just look it like a JPA that deals with the entities. Entity is a data unit which resides in the database. Say, for example, a table. The table can be termed as an entity when you are using the JPA. For example, customer, orders, product are the examples. For example, you can see customer, order, and product as entities. A DB entity can be mapped to a Java class. This we already saw in the previous slide also. So to mark a particular Java class as a entity, we have to use the annotation at the rate entity before the class definition starts. So once the runtime wildfly sees this entity, it knows that the class is representing some entity in the database. The entity class data member can be mapped to a DB field. So entity class, in the sense, a class that is marked with at entity. So when a class is marked with at entity, that class is representing some DB table. So when the class is representing a DB table, its data member can be mapped to a DB field. So for example, in products table, there will be a field called product ID, or we can say a column called product ID. That column product ID in the DB table can be mapped to a entity class data member product ID. Like a bean class, an entity class can have setter and getter methods around the field. So around the field, in the sense, here a field that is mapped to a database, and that field can have getter and setter method. So the external world make use of this getter and setter method to modify the field, thereby modifying the column data which is cached in memory. Later they can be flashed so that it will be reflected in the database. An entity class represents a table. So as already told, entity class means a class that is marked with the entity that represents a table, DB table. Each instance created from this class represents a row of data. So entity represents a data table in the database, and each field represents its column. And when you create an instance out of this entity class, that represents a row of data. So each instance created from this entity, this class means entity class, represents row of data. So you can see there is a database table called employee. It contains 3 columns. Then there are 3 rows here, 1, 2, and 3. So You can consider there are three members in the emp ent class, and the members are int employee number, string name, double salary sa. So if you see here, the mapping goes like this. The db table is mapped to the class, this is java class emp ent. So it will be marked with the entity attribute, and that represents that emp entity is emp ent. Java class is an entity class. And if you see, there are three members here. So each this member will represent the db column. If you see, number field here representing a column in the database, name, employee name, sa, salary. So since this is a class, we can create instance out of the class, right? And let's say we created two instances, and each instance will represent a row. And if you see, this is first row, and it will store employee number, name will be ab, and then salary 1000. So instance created, let's say obj1, or we call this as a entity instance 1, that represents a row. Here the second instance represents a different row, 30 gh, and salary is 1500. So this is how you should visualize. So db table is mapped to a java class. Java class contains data member maps to a column, and if there is some other data member, it may not map to a column. So you can have some data member which is internal to this class, but there are some member which will map to a column that we will see later, and we need to use some more annotation to tell this particular data member is mapping to a column. All right, so java class maps to a table, members maps to the column, and instance created out of this java class represents a row with data populated. All right, so that's what you have to visualize it. The id annotation tells a specific field represents a primary key field. So if I use the employee number, which is a primary key, let's say, and if I mark this as id, it tells that the entity here is identified by this employee number, or it's a key field in the database. So we will know all this detail when we go through the example. So entity manager and persistent unit. So persistent unit tells how to connect to the database. So we will learn about the persistent unit once we complete this example. So we already know, as part of the prerequisite, we have a JNDI name that connects to the SQL Server database. So with the persistent unit, you can tell the JPA project which database it will connect. So that's the part of a persistent unit. And the persistence unit can be specified in the XML file, and when we create the example, that time we will see the persistence.xml also. We will learn more about that when we develop the example. But for now, you can know that the persistent.xml will have a persistent unit specified inside it, and that will tell how to connect to the database. So how to connect to the database in the sense where the database is living, what is the database name, where the database is living in the sense the machine name, and what is the database name, and how to connect to the database. If there is any username, password, credential, so those credential details, all those stuff will be available through persistent unit and persistence.xml. So entity manager is an instance. It's actually interface, and with an annotation we can bring the entity manager into our JPA project, and we can mark the entity manager with a persistent unit so that the entity manager knows which database to connect and how to manage the entities. So entity manager class is to manage the entities. Entities we already saw. Database entity represented as a Java class. Then instances created out of the Java class is inside the JPA project. Those are all called entities, and entity manager manages those entities, and each entity or the instance of the entities represents a row in the database table, right? So that means entity manager manages entity means it knows how to retrieve data from the database table and represent that as a instances of Java class. That means JPA entities. Then how to persist those back to the database, thereby reflecting the retrieval as well as storage. So those are all done by the entity manager. Entity manager operates on entities. By this time you know what is meant by entities. So this class provides support for pick. Pick means a pick particular row from the database, insert, update, and delete operation. We can also use a JPA query language that we will use later, not in this video, that will perform the select operation. Here pick is also a select operation. Here using pick we will make use of the ID field and pick only one row and represent that as an entity instance, JPA entity instance. The entities cannot be a remote object. So when we use the web application and if we want to use a JPA entity, we need to use Java beans. Why? Because entities cannot be a remote object. So to come around this, we need to use either stateless session bean or MDB, and through this stateless session bean or MDB we can expose the entities. So the web application or the external world will access the Java bean and thereby indirectly making use of the entities to do the persistence, DB persistence, I mean. Let's say we have a database. So through persistent unit, we know, we in the sense here the entity manager, let's say entity manager knows. So this will be the instance, entity manager instance. It knows which database to connect. And there will be a lot of JPA entities, right? If we take the employee class, which we talked about in the previous slide, there may be multiple instances, right? We told this as object 1, object 2, object 3. Let's say O1, O2, and O3, 3 object or 3 entities. So these entities are managed by this entity manager. So entity manager will pick a particular row of data in the database and represents that as an entity. So that's what here what we mean. And the entity manager, if you see, this will actually exposed through Java Bean, right? So that's all we have to know about the JPA. So this primer is sufficient, and we can move on to our first JPA example. And once you finish all 5 or 6 part, you can come back to this very first video and you can watch it once again. So some point that is vague now will become cleared out. Something, say for example, uh, entity manager, what is persistence unit, persistence.xml. So it may look gray at this moment. Once you finish the all 5 part and once you finish the example, and if we watch this video once again, and all this thing become light to you. So there is no demo here. That's all here in this video. Thank you for watching. Bye.